Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 10. As we forge ahead with our class material, let me begin by addressing an administrative matter very briefly. You've probably noticed that as the weeks progress, participation in our discussion forums is reduced somewhat in terms of the overall number of posts that are being made. And that, of course, is that respondents are reducing as classmates are satisfying the requirements, the minimum requirements for the number of offerings to be made in the discussion forums on the textbook, responses to classmates, and the wildcard discussions as well. So it's to be expected, and it's certainly not a negative reflection in any way on the class that there is less participation. But I do want to encourage everyone that even if you have completed the required number of responses and posts to the reading forums, you are not in any way, shape, or form restricted from taking part. I would encourage you to continue to do so for a couple of reasons. One is simply that, as I've noted before, it's through the discussion forums that we're trying to reproduce something of the informal classroom conversation that would take place in a traditional setting. So the more that can happen in that regard, the better, I think. And that, too, there are other classmates that maybe have not yet finished the required number of posts, and it will help them to have more participation as well, certainly as they perhaps need to respond to a post or two yet. So if you're concerned about the grade, if you're worried that, well, I've made my posts, and if I make one that's maybe not of the same quality as an earlier one, that's going to take my grade down, don't worry about that. I will grade the posts, have been, and the overall grade will be on the basis of the posts in the order that they have been made. So when the full number of posts that is required has been satisfied, then I will not continue to grade subsequent posts or anything like that. So you're safe as far as that's concerned if you wish to take part, and I would encourage you to do so if you are at all inclined and you have the opportunity. Okay, then. Getting back into the material, we are finishing up this week McCulloch's 4-chapter treatment of the development of the Latin or Western Church. This is a large segment of history covering from, again, about the 4th century all the way up into really about the 14th century. That's where the final chapter in this week's reading will end. So a lot to cover there, and then again, as I've indicated, the same thing will take place beginning next week. We'll look at not quite the same breadth of time, but pretty close, as McCulloch will circle back and do the same thing with the emergence and development of the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church. Lots of history to cover there, and so once again, the point of this class is not to address every item and figure and doctrine, teaching, institution, so on that comes up in sufficient detail, if you like, or I guess a better way of putting it would be in every possible detail. It's rather to highlight as many of the most significant developments as possible, and to hopefully guide you, direct you to further research, not only in your seminary education, but your ongoing faith formation and ministry beyond this class. So we left off then last week roughly around the time of the 10th century, here again in the Latin or Western Church, and that's where the chapters that are assigned for this week will pick it up. And there, to begin, I want to simply highlight the flowering of monastic movements. Again, this is something that McCulloch will address in considerable with considerable acumen, as he always does, and learning. But what I want to lift up in this material it has to do a little bit less with the history, because again, he's quite good on that, and sort of the bigger picture relationship between what's going on with this flowering of monastic movements and the regulation of faith or spiritual life in the broader culture. So again, as we've discussed, monasticism begins really in the East. We talked about this in the 4th century with Antony and Pachomius in Egypt, ascetics of the Syriac church as well. It comes a little later in the West, but we saw it last week. We drew attention to Saint Benedict, the 6th century Italian monk, and the significance of the rule of Saint Benedict for subsequent monastic movements in the West. In the 10th century, one of the most important monastic movements to emerge is the movement that begins in the town of Cluny, France, the Cluniac order. And that was founded by Duke William of Aquitaine in 910. The importance of Cluny in part is the new model that it introduces in Western monasticism, and that is rather than having a monastery be an independent, self-sustaining, largely agriculturally based self-sustaining entity, so monks producing their own resources for their own survival. And then if a monk within a monastery wishes to move out and found another monastery, that new monastery would become a second independent self-sustaining unit. With the Cluniac order, a new model emerges of a federation of chapter houses, if you will, where the mother monastery, if you will, in Cluny might found subsequent, now they're called priories, because they're led by a prior who would be subordinate to the abbot in Cluny. And as I mentioned, concerning then again the integration here of all of this for the regulation of spiritual life in the Western Church. So one of the things that McCulloch indicates is that these priories can be, and in Cluny's case were, established along a very important pilgrimage route. So in other words, they can become means of helping to facilitate pilgrimage or travel to holy sites for the broader society. And not only is that a benefit to, of course, the traveling pilgrim, it can be a benefit to the monastery as well, as resources now are coming in and out of these chapter houses. And but in any case, in terms of the spiritual life, then now you have what is ostensibly a movement to separate from society in order to cultivate discipline and opportunity for personal spiritual development, growth in one's faith, growth in one's union with the divine, ultimately, reconciliation to God, the various ways that we can formulate the language of salvation as it would be pursued in these monastic movements. You have that, and with that and the proliferation of monastic orders, you have increased opportunity, of course, for the Western Church to take part or to pursue one's salvation in these orders. You certainly have that. So with the Cluniacs, the Carthusians, the Cistercians, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, all orders that McCulloch will discuss. In addition, you've got these orders now, again, in something like the Cluniac model, allowing or helping to regulate spiritual life. We began to discuss last time another way in which this takes place, and that is with the development of penance. We talked, there was a discussion forum about the Irish tariff books, or the tariff books that come out of the Irish Church, a way of, again, regulating daily spiritual life. How it is that a day-to-day Christian can make atonement or make amends for what has been done that day in their life. With the monastic, the development of monastic orders in the medieval church, McCulloch mentioned if you're a nobleman and besides the work of governing, especially the work of defending the borders of society, not only takes up a great deal of your time, but engages you in practices which still into the 900s are viewed as sinful. Making war, for instance. When I say that making war is still in the 900s viewed as sinful, I'm of course thinking ahead here to what we're going to discuss in a bit, and that is the First Crusade in 1099 and the shift that will take place in the church's attitude toward making war. But in any event, if that is something, with the proliferation of monastic orders now, penance can be made on behalf of on behalf of the nobleman, on behalf of others in society. And so again, you have these monastic movements that were founded in a sort of separatist move away from society that are helping now to regulate the life of Christendom, the life of the spiritual life of the broader culture. And that's quite an important development. With Cluny, the Cluniacs made their primary work to be the work of prayer and liturgy, a continual practice of the Mass. And again, that's quite a significant development, I think, for the Church in this era. I'm going to pause here and grab a quick drink of water, and that will actually allow me to break this video up into two segments as well, make it a little bit easier for uploading. So back in just a moment.